As president of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the organisation responsible for the creation and upkeep of the magnificent and deeply moving Menin Gate, I'm delighted to have this opportunity to thank the people of Flanders, and especially Ypres and members of the Last Post Association. The 54,000 names recorded there came from around the world.
Have you ever watched a royal ceremony that seemed perfectly familiar on the surface? Yet behind the velvet robes and feathered hats, a hidden secret was quietly preparing to change the future of the crown? On June 16th, 2025, Windsor Castle, an ancient fortress bound to centuries of power and tradition, became the stage for exactly such a moment, where what unfolded was not merely ritual, but a turning point that left the world holding its breath. That morning, the skies were clear, and the golden summer sun drenched the weathered stone walls of Windsor, transforming the castle into a living painting pulled straight out of history. The music struck up. Brass fanfares echoed across the courtyard, and each drumbeat seemed to pound like the heartbeat of a monarchy still clinging to its majesty in a modern age. The procession began. King Charles, resplendent in deep velvet robes, his towering plumed hat swaying slightly with each step, insignia gleaming on his chest. Beside him, Queen Camilla moved with her practiced composure. Behind them followed Prince William, Princess Anne, the Duke of Edinburgh, and the Knights of the Garter in their ornate regalia. Every movement was precise, rehearsed, and steeped in a sense of timeless order, as though history itself was being reenacted in real time. On the castle grounds, crowds lined the route. Straw hats tilted against the sun, parasols swaying gently in the breeze, cheers rising in waves as the parade wound its way towards St. Wend. George's Chapel. For the people gathered, this was Garter Day, the oldest and most revered of royal traditions. Born in 1348, under King Edward III, representing the crown's highest ideals of loyalty and honour. To them, it was not just a ceremony, but a bridge connecting the present to a glorious, unbroken past. And yet, beneath this veneer of pomp and continuity, something extraordinary was waiting to unfold. Within the sacred walls of St. George's Chapel, an announcement was about to shatter centuries of expectation, unseen by the cheering crowds. A decision was brewing, one that would not only redefine the events of that day, but cast a new light on the monarchy's future itself. For decades, his presence had been constant quiet, steady, and unwavering like the ancient stones of Windsor itself. Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, first cousin of Queen Elizabeth II, had lived his life not in the blaze of scandal or headlines, but in the quiet shadow of service, where duty consistently outweighed ambition. At 89 years old, he stood as the oldest working member of the British royal family, a figure shaped by nearly a century of tradition, bound by loyalty to the crown. And yet, as the Garter Day of 2025 unfolded, the passing of years could no longer be concealed. The detail was subtle, almost easy to overlook. But to those who noticed, it revealed everything. For the first time in living memory, the Duke did not march proudly in the procession. Instead, he was driven to St. George's Chapel, his carriage replacing the confident stride that had long symbolized his resilience. Still, the dignity of his presence was unshaken. To the Order of the Garter, he was not merely a name inscribed among its knights, he was its heart and anchor. A man who had worn its insignia since 1985 and treated it not as a ceremonial ornament, but as the very essence of his public life. His decades of service were defined not by glamour, but by relentless duty. Thousands of engagements carried out quietly. Support for charities from lifeboat crews to war graves. The representation of the crown at countless state occasions. To the public, he was never flamboyant, rarely in the gossip columns, but he embodied a purer, older royal code, loyalty without spectacle. service without applause. Yet beneath the surface of his reserved demeanour, the Duke of Kent carried with him a burden of decision. For months, perhaps even years, he had weighed the question that now pressed against him. Who would inherit the guardianship of one of Britain's most sacred orders? He was a man of precision, never given to rash impulses, and every step toward this moment had been deliberate. In the privacy of his study at Kensington Palace, in conversations held softly with the king and trusted advisers, he had prepared for a day when tradition itself would need to bend to the demands of survival. The sight of him that morning, frail in body but unbowed in spirit, moved those who looked closely. Few believed he would do more than observe the ritual as he always had. But there was a light in his eyes, a quiet resolve that spoke of finality, of readiness. And in the hush of the chapel, before the prayers and pageantry began, an unspoken tension lingered, the sense that the Duke was about to place the weight of centuries into new hands. And the unanswered question trembled in the air: whose hands would those be? Inside St. George's Chapel, time itself seemed to pause. The soaring Gothic arches, the stained glass windows bathed in colours of ruby and gold, and the hushed stillness of the gathered congregation created an atmosphere steeped in centuries of ritual. Every detail was precise, every movement rehearsed over generations. The measured footsteps of the knights, the solemn prayers, the grandeur of the procession. It was supposed to be familiar, predictable, a page torn from the monarchy's oldest book. Yet on this day, the script of tradition was about to be rewritten. All eyes inevitably drifted toward the Duke of Kent. His frame appeared fragile, his shoulders bent beneath the weight of age. Yet his gaze betrayed an intensity that had not dimmed. To most, he was expected to simply bear witness, as he always had, to honour the continuity of an institution older than almost every stone surrounding them. But then, with deliberate resolve, he began to rise. The movement was slow, measured, his body unsteady, yet commanding. And as he stood, a ripple of unease swept across the chapel. Conversations stilled, breaths caught, and even seasoned royal watchers sensed instinctively that something extraordinary was about to unfold. When his voice broke the silence, it carried the tremor of age, but the gravity of authority. He spoke not of pomp, not of pageantry, but of continuity, of duty, of the survival of the crown. His words hung heavy in the vaulted air, layered with emotion, each syllable echoing with the authority of nearly 9 decades of service. And then came the words that no one had foreseen. The Duke of Kent declared that he would step back from his role as the leader of the Order of the Garter and place its stewardship directly in the hands of Catherine, Princess of Wales. The effect was seismic. Gasps spread like a wave through the pews, followed by a stunned silence that seemed to press against the chapel walls. This was no ceremonial reshuffling, no gradual passing of responsibility in the quiet corridors of palace life. This was a rupture in tradition, a decision made in full public view, a royal earthquake reverberating through an institution built on continuity. Catherine, seated among the spouses of the knights, froze for a moment, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the magnitude of what had been thrust upon her. Her eyes shimmer, her lips parted in a faint, trembling smile, as though she could feel the weight of centuries settling onto her shoulders. King Charles, seated in his place of authority, gave a slow, approving nod, his expression softened by the unmistakable glint of tears. Evenhay, a man raised within the relentless discipline of monarchy, seemed visibly moved. And then the unthinkable happened. As the Duke concluded his words, the chapel broke into applause. Centuries of protocol forbade such a display within these sacred walls. But in that moment, rules dissolved. The clapping, the echoing thunder of hands striking together, was not merely appreciation, it was recognition. Every soul in St. George's Chapel understood that they were witnessing history. The silence after the applause was almost more powerful than the noise itself. In St. George's Chapel, where solemnity had always reigned supreme, the sound of clapping still echoed faintly against the ancient stone, as if the walls themselves were reluctant to let go of what had just happened. When the Duke of Kent lowered himself back into his seat, the weight of his words still hung in the air, and every gaze turned instinctively toward the woman who now carried that burden, Catherine, Princess of Wales. She sat with the stillness of someone caught between humility and destiny. Her eyes glistened as though holding back tears, but her smile remained faint, deliberate, a mask of composure laced with the gravity of the moment. It was not triumph that defined her expression, but reverence. She understood what had just been placed in her hands. Not simply a title, but a legacy of service spanning nearly 7 centuries. For a heartbeat, it felt as though the entire monarchy had shifted upon its axis. King Charles, seated only a few steps away, could not disguise the depth of his reaction. Known for his restraint, for his ability to endure scrutiny without flinching, he was seen dabbing discreetly at the corner of his eye. To those watching closely, the meaning was unmistakable. This was not only approval but pride. The recognition that Catherine represented both continuity and evolution. His slow, deliberate nod in her direction was a signal more eloquent than any words, an acknowledgement that the crown's future was safe in her keeping. Prince William, usually the very embodiment of royal composure, revealed what protocol could not contain. Pride radiated from his face as he looked at his wife. His partner, his equal, in his gaze was not only admiration, but relief, as though the years of preparation, the countless moments of pressure endured together, had finally crystallized into this defining instant. When Catherine glanced briefly toward him, their eyes locked in a silent exchange, a moment of unity that spoke louder than the grandest declarations. The monarchy, so often portrayed as cold and distant, revealed in that glance a rare truth. Beneath the weight of crowns and titles, it was still built on human connection. The congregation, sensing the rawness of the moment, remained hushed, their solemn faces reflecting the gravity of what they had witnessed. Even seasoned courtiers, accustomed to the endless rhythm of royal ceremony, seemed shaken by the intimacy of it all. In those few minutes, the monarchy appeared not as an untouchable institution, but as a family grappling with change, passing a torch, not with ceremony alone, but with visible emotion. And so, within the vaulted walls of St. George's Chapel, amid the echoes of applause and the shimmer of unfallen tears, the approval of king, heir, and people alike sealed what the Duke of Kent had begun. The past had bowed, the present had embraced, and the future had quietly, unmistakably, arrived. What had unfolded inside St. George's Chapel was far more than a ceremonial gesture. It was a shift in the balance of power, a signal to the world that tradition could bend when survival demanded it. For centuries, the Order of the Garter had been a bastion of continuity, a living thread stretching back to King Edward III in the year 1348. Its leadership had always symbolized not only honor, but the very heartbeat of loyalty to the crown. For the Duke of Kent, who had carried this role since 1985, relinquishing, it was not a matter of personal retirement, it was a conscious act of legacy. By placing that legacy into the hands of Catherine, Princess of Wales, he was sending a message that echoed far beyond the vaulted arches of Windsor. It was not simply about honoring her years of quiet service, her careful navigation of the monarchy's often treacherous path between tradition and modern life. It was about declaring to the nation and to the Commonwealth that Catherine was no longer a supporting figure in the royal narrative. She was now one of its central pillars, entrusted with guiding one of Britain's most ancient institutions into the future. To many observers, This moment crystallized the monarchy's recognition that endurance alone is not enough. The world no longer bows unquestioningly before crowns and titles. To survive, the crown must inspire, must adapt, must find new ways of connecting with those who watch it so closely. Catherine, with her ability to embody dignity without aloofness, to balance poise with empathy, represented precisely that evolution. Her appointment was not the preservation of the old order, it was the reimagining of it. For King Charles, the transition also carried a deeper strategy. His reign has long been defined by the idea of a leaner, more purposeful monarchy, one capable of shedding excess and focusing on relevance. By publicly endorsing the Duke of Kent's decision, he was not only affirming Catherine's worth, but also weaving her into the monarchy's central framework of survival. It was as though the king himself was saying, "The crown does not merely look backward, it prepares for the storms to come." Thus, the meaning of the transition stretched beyond the order's ancient insignia, beyond the velvet robes and the ceremonial carriages. It was the monarchy's way of telling the world that its greatest strength lies not in rigidity, but in its ability to evolve. And in that evolution, Catherine stood as both symbol and architect, a guardian of tradition, and at the same time, the builder of a future not yet written. What appeared in the chapel as a sudden, breathtaking announcement had in truth been years in the making. The Duke of Kent was never a man of impulse. His life had been built on the scaffolding of duty, restraint, and precision. Every engagement, every public word, every gesture carried the weight of calculation and responsibility. To believe that he would place one of the crown's oldest traditions into new hands on a whim would be to misunderstand the very essence of who he was. This moment had been prepared in silence, in patience, and in the quiet corridors of royal life, far from the eyes of the public, for months, perhaps even years. He had been shaping this transition inside his Kensington Palace apartments, over tea, poured in porcelain that had survived generations. He shared with Catherine lessons that were less about rules and more about instincts, how to carry oneself when history pressed too heavily on the shoulders, how to read the unspoken language of statecraft, how to embody continuity while gently nudging it toward change. These were not lessons recorded in books or manuals of protocol. They were lived truths, hard-earned through decades of navigating the unrelenting currents of monarchy. Catherine, ever attentive, absorbed them with a quiet diligence that mirrored his own. She knew the value of listening, of learning without spectacle, of allowing wisdom to seep in like water through stone. Those who observed her public evolution, the measured way she engaged with crowds, her balance of elegance and warmth, the rare ability to stand regal, yet remain relatable, were in fact witnessing the subtle imprint of the Duke's mentorship. He was, as one courtier once remarked, a walking history book, with one eye fixed firmly on the horizon. The consultations behind closed doors were equally deliberate. The Duke had spoken in confidence with the King, mapping out what such a handover would mean, not just for Catherine, but for the monarchy itself. This was not the discarding of duty, but the safeguarding of a legacy. By stepping back while still present, by handing over the mantle while his voice still carried authority, he ensured that the transition would be seen not as abdication, but as trust. He was not fading into irrelevance. He was orchestrating continuity. Thus, when he rose in the chapel that June morning, it was not the tremor of spontaneity, but the culmination of careful planning. What the world perceived as a moment of surprise was, in truth, the closing chapter of a long mentorship, a deliberate act by a man who had spent his life serving in the shadows and who chose, at the twilight of his years, to step forward with one last gesture of enduring significance. In silence, he had prepared the way, and in silence, he would now watch Catherine carry it forward. From the moment she entered the royal family, in the year 2011, Catherine was measured against impossible expectations. She was the young bride, stepping into a dynasty where every glance, every gesture, and every word would be weighed against centuries of tradition. At first, the public saw her as the supportive consort to Prince William, the smiling figure in polished dresses, the reassuring presence at his side. Yet quietly, methodically, Catherine was carving out an identity of her own, one rooted not only in elegance, but in substance. Her work spoke louder than her titles. She championed mental health long before it became a mainstream conversation, lending her voice to those who struggled in silence. She placed early childhood development at the center of her advocacy, recognizing that the foundation of society begins in its youngest years. She raised awareness of cancer, not through grand declarations, but by bringing compassion to the forefront of a subject often wrapped in fear. Each of these causes carried the stamp of her authenticity, a rare ability to combine royal duty with human connection. Over time, her image evolved. The once tentative newcomer grew into a figure of composure and quiet authority. Her posture at public engagements, balanced between warmth and formality, echoed the poise of Queen Elizabeth II. Yet her ease with ordinary people set her apart as something distinctly modern. She could kneel to speak with a child in the crowd, then stand moments later to converse with world leaders. And in both roles, she appeared equally at home. This duality of timeless dignity and approachable humanity became her hallmark. It was this transformation that made the Duke of Kent's decision resonate so profoundly. He was not handing the leadership of the Order of the Garter to a symbol, but to a woman who had proven her resilience through years of scrutiny, her steadiness through storms, both public and private, and her ability to embody continuity while guiding it into relevance. Catherine was no longer the young bride finding her footing. She had become the image of a leader calm under pressure, compassionate in action, and unwavering in her commitment to service. In the eyes of the monarchy, she now represented both memory and possibility. She was the bridge between the centuries-old rituals that defined Windsor's walls and the modern spirit that demanded the crown remain more than relic. On that Garter Day, when the Duke entrusted her with an honour older than many nations, Catherine stood not as the consort of an heir, but as a cornerstone in her own right, a figure ready to hold the line between past and future. On paper, the leadership of the Order of the Garter is a ceremonial role, an honour draped in velvet robes and centuries of ritual, its duties confined largely to the pageantry of Garter Day itself. But Catherine's acceptance of the mantle signalled something more than continuity. It carried the quiet promise of transformation, of breathing relevance into an institution that, though ancient, must speak to a world that no longer bows instinctively before symbols of power. Catherine has never been content to preserve tradition as though it were a museum piece. Her vision has always been to safeguard history while opening it to new generations, ensuring that the values at its core, honour, service, loyalty, remain living forces rather than relics. Early conversations among palace insiders revealed that she intends to widen the reach of the order beyond the cloisters of Windsor and St. George's Chapel. She is already exploring ways to bring its story to the public, curated exhibitions of rare artifacts, immersive programs for schools, interactive digital archives that would allow people across the globe to explore nearly 7 centuries of its history. Such ambitions are not without precedent in her royal work. Catherine has applied the same principle to her projects in early childhood development, in mental health, and in raising awareness around cancer. Evolve or fade. In her eyes, tradition must not only be preserved but made accessible, relevant, and meaningful in the present day. The Order of the Garter, once known only to a select few, may under her guidance become both a symbol of continuity and a platform for education and engagement. In practical terms, this means a deliberate shift. Annual ceremonies would remain untouched, steeped in the grandeur that connects each generation of royals to their forebears. But alongside that spectacle, Catherine envisions outreach programs grounded in the values of the order itself. schools may soon teach the ideals of service and honor, not as abstract principles, but as living lessons connected to one of the most prestigious traditions of the crown. Digital archives may open windows into centuries of guarded records, inviting people everywhere to step inside the legacy of knights and monarchs who once shaped the course of Britain's history. The symbolic weight of such a change cannot be overstated. By marrying the ancient with the modern, Catherine would not only protect the sanctity of the order, but ensure its endurance in an age defined by skepticism and distance from monarchy. This is what makes her stewardship more than ceremonial. It is an experiment in relevance, an attempt to show that even the oldest traditions can adapt without losing their soul. And so, the future of the Order of the Garter rests now in her hands. A woman whose journey has been defined by balance between tradition and progress, between duty and empathy, between public expectation and personal authenticity. If she succeeds, the Order will not merely survive the 21st century. It will emerge renewed, carrying its history forward with a voice that speaks not only of the past, but to the future yet to be written. Beneath the grandeur of velvet robes and the solemn cadence of tradition, there was another story quietly unfolding on that Garter Day. A story not just of Catherine's ascension, but of the royal family itself. For years, the monarchy had been portrayed as fractured, strained beneath the weight of loss, public scrutiny, and private battles. The passing of Queen Elizabeth II had left a void impossible to fill, and with it came questions about whether the institution could withstand the relentless winds of change. Yet in Windsor that day, before the eyes of the world, the royal family presented something rare. A picture of unshakable unity. The symbolism was unmistakable. King Charles, who had spent his reign advocating a leaner and more purposeful monarchy, gave his full approval with visible emotion. Queen Camilla, often the target of divided public opinion, walked with serene composure beside him, embodying steadiness rather than controversy. Prince William stood as Catherine's silent champion, his pride unconcealed, his gaze fixed on her as though to remind the world that their bond was both personal and political. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, famed for her blunt pragmatism, lent quiet strength through her presence, while the Duke of Edinburgh and the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester rounded out the procession with dignified solidarity. Ach figure. Each step, each gesture seemed to speak the same message. The monarchy was not faltering, it was closing ranks. The decision of the Duke of Kent, though deeply personal, became in that moment a collective endorsement. It was as if the entire family, by standing shoulder to shoulder, had woven his gesture into their own shared fabric of survival. The applause that had broken protocol inside St. 20 Vere. George's Chapel was not only for Catherine's new role, it was for the monarchy itself, for its ability to adapt without unraveling, to show strength not through rigidity, but through unity. Beyond the gilded carriages and the pageantry, this unity carried profound meaning. The royal family had weathered storms that might have splintered lesser institutions, scandals that dominated headlines, health battles endured under the gaze of millions, and the lingering grief of a matriarch whose shadow still stretched across every stone of Windsor. Yet on this day, the fractures were invisible. Instead, what the world saw was a family bound together by shared duty, by history, and by the unspoken recognition that their survival depends on their solidarity. In the quiet glances exchanged between Catherine and the Duke of Kent, in the approving nod from the King, in the steady pride of William, in the supportive presence of Anne and Camilla, there was a collective truth that the crown, though carried by individuals, endures only when it is shouldered together. And so, the message of Garter Day was as much about Catherine as it was about the family she now symbolized. Unity, in that moment, became the monarchy's greatest weapon. As the service ended and the royal carriages rolled slowly out of Windsor's gates, the roar of the crowds rose like a tide, washing over the stone walls that had stood for centuries. The cheers were not only for the pageantry of Garter Day, not only for the gleam of robes and insignia, but for the sense that they had witnessed something irreversible. Within the sacred hush of St. Bala, George's Chapel, a centuries-old order had shifted, and the future of the monarchy had been written in real time. Inside the carriages, the atmosphere was quieter, more intimate. The Duke of Kent, usually the embodiment of stoic reserve, allowed himself a rare, genuine smile, the kind that comes when a burden has finally been lifted. He had done what duty demanded, safeguarded a legacy by entrusting it to the one person he believed could carry it forward. Catherine, seated beside William, remained composed, but the weight of the moment clung to her like an invisible cloak. Her hand slipped into his, and in that silent gesture was the recognition of all they had endured together, the scrutiny, the sacrifice, the relentless demands of service. Their clasped hands were not only a sign of partnership, but a vow to face the road ahead as one. For the monarchy, this day would be remembered as more than ceremony. It was a turning point, a statement that survival depends on evolution. That loyalty to the crown must be paired with relevance to the people. By placing the Order of the Garter in Catherine's care, the Duke of Kent had effectively declared her not just a guardian of tradition, but an architect of the crown's future. It was a message of continuity, yes, but also of change and acknowledgement that history must breathe, must adapt, must belong to every generation anew. The image of Catherine stepping into her new role will linger, not only for the pearls at her neck or the elegance of her attire, but for what she represented in that instant, the bridge between the monarchy's storied past and its uncertain, unfolding future. She was no longer only the Princess of Wales, the consort of an heir. She had become, in the eyes of her people and her family, a pillar upon which the institution itself now rested. And so, Garter Day of June the 16th, 2025, will be remembered not as another repetition of a medieval tradition, but as the day when silence gave way to applause, when history bent to the needs of the present, and when the monarchy, against all expectation, revealed its most human truth, that even behind crowns and carriages, the future of the crown rests not in ceremony alone, but in the strength of those who dare to carry it forward